Welcome to Strip Cover Lit. I'm Adrian Fort, and I'm here with you for this week's writerly quote of the week. This week's quote comes again from John Gardner in The Art of Fiction on page 123. We get, "What the young writer needs to develop to achieve his goal of becoming a great artist is not a set of aesthetic laws, but artistic mastery." One more time. What the young writer needs to develop to achieve his goal of becoming a great artist is not a set of aesthetic laws, but artistic mastery. Sounds cryptic, right? So let's start by breaking down a couple of those terms involved, namely aesthetic laws and mastery. Aesthetic laws, what might those be? You're probably familiar with Leonardo da Vinci's The Vitruvian Man, right? The dimensions laid out so brilliantly in this piece are the aesthetics of the human form. If you were to draw a form by the dimensions and proportions of this piece, whoever's looking at that drawing will be able to tell that it is human. Those are aesthetic laws. It is a humanoid that follows those dimensions. Writing operates in very much the same way. Writing and stories are easily recognizable as certain types when they check certain boxes. It's important to note here that Gardner is actually sort of arguing us away from checking boxes. But he's only sort of arguing us away from checking those boxes. Sort of? How is that? Well, I think it's important to jump into the term mastery here. John Gardner, or Robert Greene, who wrote the book on mastery, literally, it's called Mastery, starts his book off with this quote. This is the opening paragraph from the book. "There exists a form of power and intelligence that represents the high point of human potential. It is the source of the greatest achievements and discoveries in history. It is an intelligence that is not taught in our schools nor analyzed by professors, but almost all of us, at some point, have had glimpses of it in our own experience. It comes to us in a period of tension, facing a deadline, the urgent need to solve a problem, a crisis of sorts. Or it can come as the result of constant work on a project. In any event, pressed by circumstances, we feel unusually energized and focused. Our minds become completely absorbed in the task before us. This intense concentration sparks all kinds of ideas. They come to us as we fall asleep, out of nowhere, as if springing from our unconscious. At times, other people seem less resistant to our influence. Perhaps we are more attentive to them. Or we appear to have special powers that inspire their respect. We might normally experience life in a passive mode, constantly reacting to this or that incident. But for these days or weeks, we feel like we can determine events and make things happen." This feeling of power, influence, and action is a brief glimpse into the state known as mastery. By breaking those terms down, we get a glimpse at what the quote is really saying, at least if you ask me. A writer has to get to the point where he or she is not thinking, wondering, or asking what parts or elements of a story come next. Those parts and elements of the story simply flow from them. This is not to say that good writing is simply paint by number, but good writing does have a feeling of inevitability without a feeling of predictability. Without that next part of the story coming free from strain, it will be difficult to make that writing feel inevitable. It will feel and look and read forced to your audience, which is an automatic turnoff when you're delving into the pages of a book. However, if the next part comes too easily and is predictable, is paint by numbers, because we're sticking to a specific formula, that feeling of predictability very easily turns a reader off. Think of every M. Night Shyamalan movie you saw after the first one you saw. You're sitting there wondering, okay, what's the trick? Where's the turn? When is it coming out? So you spend the rest of the movie trying to figure it out rather than being delved into that world. One way to possibly combat these ills is simply to listen to Papa. Hemingway always said that we should stop writing when we know what happens next. He also said that every time we sit down to write, we should read everything that we wrote and kept from the day before. What this will do is to put us right back into the flow when we sit down to write. Also, if you stop when you know what's happening next, the fear might be, but I'll forget. I'll forget before I sit down the next day. But what ends up happening is everything in the back of your head is still working on that story, laying it out, spreading it open, and just picking it apart. And when you sit down the next day, everything that your mind unconsciously went through while you were away from the story just sort of spills onto the page. So, before you get back to your writerly endeavors, one more time, the writerly quote of the week, this from John Gardner in The Art of Fiction. What the young writer needs to develop to achieve his goal of becoming a great artist is not a set of aesthetic laws, but artistic mastery.